Hi everyone, so today we're going to be starting the topic of psychopathology, which is looking at mental illnesses or abnormalities. Now in your textbook it's arranged slightly differently to in your booklet, so I just wanted to make you aware of how we are structuring the course. So first of all, we're going to look at 4 different definitions of abnormality. This is how psychologists decide whether someone is mentally well or not. And then we're going to look at the explanations and treatments for each of the mental health disorders we're learning about. So we're going to look at explaining why depression happens and then how we treat it, and then followed the same by OCD and phobias. So today we're going to be looking at one particular definition, which is deviation from social norms. We're going to look at defining the key terms in social norms and looking at how we can evaluate the effectiveness of this definition. So on the next page are some pictures. I'd like you to create a continuum with normal at one end and abnormal at the other end. Once you've done that, I want you to decide whether your grandparents or great-grandparents would have ordered this differently, explaining why you think they might have ordered it differently. So pause the video and have a quick decision about where you would order these. So some of you might have put, for example, that same-sex marriages are normal now, in that there are more people who have same-sex marriages now than before. And equally, that house husbands are becoming more common, so this is a more normal behaviour. Whereas people with body tattoos, maybe like, for example, all over their face like this guy, probably aren't very normal. But equally, you might have said that if you just have a tattoo, that is quite normal nowadays. If you compared this to your grandparents, for example, they might have said that having tattoos isn't very normal because not many people used to have tattoos, or that house husbands weren't so common then, so they would view them as less normal. So there are different definitions of abnormality, but psychopathology is looking at the scientific study of psychological disorders. And when we talk about abnormal in this topic, we're talking about mental illnesses, not your usual definition of abnormal. It might be worth writing down somewhere that that's what we mean by abnormal. And for definitions of abnormality, it's about how health professionals would decide whether someone is mentally well or not. So it's useful to know how people define it, because it will differ depending on where we are and what definition we use. Now, it's worth also noting that although we've got 4 definitions here, none of them are perfect in helping us decide whether someone is normal or not, and that will affect how we treat certain people in society. Thinking back to, for example, the man who has tattoos all over his face, as a society we would accept that's probably not that normal, and therefore we might treat them differently or discriminate against them because of what they look like. And is that okay? So I want to pause the video and have a think about what is a social norm, maybe think of an example, and how can we use this to explain that someone is abnormal. So social norms are rules that society have about what's acceptable in our world. And some of these rules are explicit, where we're told what's normal and what's not. For example, it's not okay to drink and drive. We know that because it'd be breaking the law, and so that's explicit. But some are unspoken rules or implicit rules, and these are things where we just know that it's not normal, but we've never actually been told that it isn't. So, for example, often, like in the UK, we hate being close to strangers. So if you stood too close to someone, then that would be viewed as abnormal. And people who violate these norms are considered abnormal. And remember, again, we're talking about abnormal in terms of mental health issues. So when you're answering application questions for this type of question, you need to explain what the social norm is. So you need to explain the definition of a social norm and how that person breaks the social norm and is therefore abnormal. Naming the definitions is important, so you must use the correct title. So you must say deviation from social norms. So in this question it says that Diane is a 30-year-old businesswoman, and if she does not get her own way, that sometimes she has a temper tantrum. Recently she attended her grandmother's funeral and laughed during the prayers, and when she talks to people she often stands very close to them, making them feel uncomfortable. So the question is, identify one definition of abnormality that could describe Diane's behaviour and explain your choice. Now this is really important because we've got two different command words here. We've got identify, which states that we need to explain and give the definition of abnormality. So which of the four definitions is it? And then we've got to describe it and explain why. And that's why it's 1 plus 2 marks. So 1 mark for identifying and then 2 marks for explaining your choice. Pause the video now and have a think about how you might answer this question and how you might structure it. So my example answer is that this definition explains why people who violate social norms are classed as abnormal. So I've referred to social norms and I've identified that as the definition that I'm going to use. I've then gone on to explain it. So I've said that social norms include respecting people's personal space and showing appropriate affect. So here I've explained the definition of abnormality, but also within the context of Diane, without explicitly referring to Diane. And then I'm going to refer explicitly to Diane as stated in the green. Diane laughed at a funeral and stands too close to people, which are behaviours that are not seen as socially acceptable. The main thing that people make mistakes on here is that they only write 2 sentences instead of 3. They forget that they need to explain what the definition is before you explicitly apply it to Diane. So in fact, in a way, you're kind of getting 2 description marks and then an application mark. See it as that way so that you remember to do all of the information and not just get 2 marks for your answer. So you need to be able to evaluate this definition, so have a think about the following answers to these questions. Earlier in the lesson you decided that grandparents may have ordered the continuum differently. How is this a weakness? Are social norms the same in every culture? Although statistically rare, having a high IQ is socially acceptable. How is this a strength of the definition? And then how do you think the definition could have been used to control people in the past? Pause the video and have a think. So you might have said about that your parents or your grandparents or your great-grandparents might have ordered the continuum differently. And this is a problem because different people will view social norms differently. And that means that we can't be sure that our definitions of social norms or how we decide whether someone is mentally well or not isn't just based on our personal opinion. And that's not a good thing because it's subjective. Social norms aren't the same in every culture. Some cultures, as we said, don't like standing too close. Other cultures don't mind it. And there are many different many different cultural issues, and that means that it's different because in one culture we might diagnose someone with a mental health disorder, and in another culture it might be socially acceptable. A good example of this is schizophrenia. In the UK, it's not normal to hear voices of, say, your relatives or someone speaking to you, but in other cultures it is acceptable to hear voices of the dead people talking to you because it's a way of communicating with your ancestors, so therefore they wouldn't be diagnosed with this here. Although it's statistically rare, having a high IQ is socially acceptable, and that means that because we have a socially acceptable behaviour, then people cannot be diagnosed with things that are abnormal but are socially acceptable. So in another definition, you could be diagnosed with a mental health disorder if you had a high IQ, which is just ridiculous because it's obviously not a mental health disorder. And how do you think the definition could have been used to control people in the past? Well, if you think about, for example, gay marriages not being acceptable because it wasn't socially normal, this means that we're controlling what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, when actually we recognise today that people being able to marry no matter who they're attracted to is socially acceptable. You might want to think about writing an evaluation paragraph for some of these. So this is a good way of explaining it. You have to make your point as usual. So cultural relativism is an issue for the definition. Add your examples. So think about an idea that is socially acceptable in one culture and not in another culture. And then explain why it's a strength or a weakness. So this is a problem because of the external validity, how the definition can only be used in one culture and not in the others. I hope that was helpful. Thank you for watching.